So based on a suggestion from a previous video comment, I'm going to take a quick look at the TMNT movies, primarily the ones that were made by Jim Henson and that one CGI reboot. Not the Michael Bay ones, because I haven't seen those ones. Sorry. One thing to address before we begin is that even though these movies came out at the peak of the cartoon series success in the late 80s and early 90s, it's actually not based off the cartoon. It's actually based around the original TMNT comic books by Peter Laird and Kevin Eastman. Apparently the company that made these movies wanted to get a hold of the cartoon license in order to make a movie, but they couldn't get it because they were independent. So they went to the comics instead, which was a nice clever little workaround. And I did indeed mention that Jim Henson was involved in these movies. Apparently his kids were a big fan of the TMNT cartoon series and he also liked them as well, so he decided to join in, at a reduced fee from what he was normally expecting because obviously they couldn't afford to pay him at his full. But wow, did he do a good job with these movies. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's take a look at the first one. The first TMNT movie was released in 1990 and directed by Steve Barron, who also did the music video for Take On Me by a-ha. And I'm not kidding, he genuinely did that. He would also go on to direct the Coneheads movie. As I said, this movie is based off of the original comics and is more or less an adaptation of the first story arc, which is basically the first 5 or so issues of the original comic. And it does it pretty damn well, so if you're more familiar with the comics, you'll know that they're definitely a lot more gritty than they were compared to what the show was like at the time. In fact, the very first issue was actually a spoof of Daredevil's origin story of all things. It's one of those things where you think about it, it's like, how is that possible? But actually when you think about it, all the pieces do kind of add up. The Turtles are created out the spill of a vial with some strange ooze in it, which is the same way that Daredevil got his superpowers. Their mentor is someone called Splinter, and Daredevil's mentor was called Stick, and they fight against a clan called The Foot, and Daredevil fights against a clan called The Hand. It's one of those things that once you notice it, it becomes surprisingly really obvious. Despite it initially starting off as a spoof, it developed into something a lot more deep and had a lot more grit and drama to it over time, and that is reflected in this movie. It is surprisingly heavy in some sections. The cinematography does help a lot with that. It's very dark, it's very moody shot, and it's got a lot of great uses of shadow and lighting in it, and it definitely has that kind of grimy, kind of dodgy New York feel to it, which really works well in creating this movie's identity. Even though this movie is an adaptation of the very first story arc of the comics, it is mixed up a little bit. For example, in the original comic, in the very first issue, the Shredder actually dies, and it was his clones that fought the Turtles from then on. Here, it's the original all the way through, and that fight on the top of the building at the end of the movie was how the original first comic ended, so it's like they basically split the story of the first issue in half and then put the end at the end of the movie. But otherwise it does actually pan out really well. The stuff involving the meeting of the Turtles, April, Casey and Shredder, going to the farm after Raphael gets beaten up, and all that other such stuff, it really works really well. And like I said, the Jim Henson effects are easily the best part of the movie. This is hands down some of the best animatronic work I've ever seen in my life. You genuinely believe they are there. You do not even comprehend that these are guys in suits with really advanced animatronics in their heads. You just see giant anthropomorphic turtles and it looks so amazing. And I really commend Jim Henson for putting in his all in a movie where he didn't really need to. Like I said, he wasn't paid as much as he normally is for these sorts of jobs. It was just something he did because he liked the franchise. And I really respect that. He did an incredible job with these guys. The first movie does also kind of capture the feel of the late 80s. The original comics were made in the early 80s, but this definitely feels like something that was made in the late 80s, particularly with the kind of almost the early grunge stuff that was starting to become a thing in the early 80s and then obviously became more prominent in the early 90s. But it still has some of the elements of the kind of glowy pastel neon elements that the mid and late 80s also had as well. It's definitely got a unique look to it, and even though it does look dated, it's still really cool to look at. Overall, while the first movie, admittedly there's elements of it that do feel a little bit corny, it is still very entertaining and a very faithful adaptation of the original TMNT comics. The second movie, I admit this movie I do love a lot, but it's definitely inferior to the first one. So the first movie probably got a lot of complaints for how dark and gritty and violent it was, so this movie definitely makes things a lot more lighthearted. In fact, it feels more like they're trying to capture the feel of the cartoon series at the time. But in that regard, in an attempt to be more like the cartoon series as a live-action film, it's pretty good. It's still very funny, and even though it's more colourful, it still looks very impressive, and the costumes still look as great as they always did. And yeah, it just has a lot of fun elements in it that make it a very entertaining movie to watch. So as a result of it trying to be more like the cartoon series, it's virtually got nothing to do with the comics anymore. Nothing in what happens in this movie is similar to a storyline within the comics. If they were going to follow up with what the comics did, then they would have had the turtles go into space and meet the Fugitoid and the Triceratons and such like that. But no, they stick it on Earth and just have them fight some mutants, very much like how the cartoon series did it. In fact, while the mutants in this movie are not Bebop and Rocksteady from the cartoon series, they clearly are trying to invoke the feel of Bebop and Rocksteady, even though they're not. They're called Toka and Razar, and they're a wolf and a turtle. But they are entertaining, and somehow are even more childish than Bebop and Rocksteady were, if that's even possible. But they do look amazing, particularly with the costumes looking really good on them as well. Even if the facial design is a little bit more cartoony and goofy and they're not as expressive as the turtles are, they still look really good. David Warner as one of the supporting characters is surprisingly really entertaining. He plays his role way more intense than he needs to, but it is a lot of fun, and I love David Warner, so I'm just happy to see him in there. And of course, there's the infamous ninja rap by Vanilla Ice, and it's one of those things that contextually you do have to understand, because Vanilla Ice was a big up-and-comer at the time. I mean, a lot of people just see him as a joke now, and obviously a lot of people saw him as a joke back then, but to the public at large, he was one of the biggest names in music. He won several awards and was massively hurrah'd for bringing rap to the white culture, which again nowadays seems laughable because of how bad he was, but again, you have to kind of put yourself in the mindset, and it's kind of entertaining regardless, even if, again, he's not that great of a rapper, but Ninja Rap's actually one of his better songs, to be honest. Then the third movie. I have no idea what they were going for this one. So the second one was definitely trying to be more like how the cartoon series was. I suppose in a way you could argue the third movie's trying that as well, but even so, it feels like a completely different movie. It doesn't even feel like it was trying to be a Ninja Turtles movie. It feels like it was trying to be some kind of samurai movie, and then they just threw the turtles into it. In fact, the whole movie just kind of feels like it was a contractual obligation. No one actually wanted to make this, and they just kind of had to be forced to because, well, the second one did really well, let's make another one. But you can clearly tell that the people involved really didn't care with this time around, and it really shows. So the plot of this one is that the Turtles find what is weirdly a very deep cut in terms of TMNT lore, which is the Time Scepter, which is usually used by the Time Lords, not the Doctor Who ones, but the TMNT ones, and they accidentally get transported back in time to the age of feudal Japan and end up becoming samurais. And that's more or less the whole plot that you need. There's not really anything else to say about it. So the costumes look really bad this time. I mean, I suppose on a technical level they're still somewhat impressive, but yeah, they are definitely a downgrade from the previous two movies, particularly with the way in which the mouths move. It's so jerky and robotic, it just looks awful. It doesn't have the kind of same sense of grittiness and realism, relatively speaking anyway, that the first movie had, and it doesn't have the fun aspects of the second movie. It's just really a big waste, to be honest, even though, again, on a technical level, there are still some impressive things about it. In fact, in terms of its actual cinematography, you could argue it's the most ambitious of all the movies, but yeah, it just felt like a movie where they just really didn't know what they were doing. But I can't say that it's the worst movie ever, like a lot of people say it is. It is a bad movie, but there are still some things that are somewhat entertaining about it. And then finally, the fourth movie, which was just known as TMNT, which was released in 2007. This was effectively a sort of long-awaited sequel, half reboot of the original franchise. It's left vague whether or not it's within the same continuity as the previous three movies, but they do drop hints that it is. But it definitely feels more like it's trying to be an adaptation of the original comics again, but this time tell an original story. And that was actually kind of a clever idea. It is a little bit tricky and it does make the whole movie very confusing, but it does definitely feel like the old Mirage comics, and I really appreciate that. The plot is a little bit overcomplicated than it needs to be. It's about these ancient warriors that are brought back to modern day and something like that, and even though TMNT Mirage did do a lot of stories like this, it's not the most interesting. TMNT Mirage normally does its best when it's dealing with sci-fi based plots, or just stuff that's so ridiculous that you can't even kind of comprehend it. These ancient mystic stories just don't kind of work for me. They can be done well, but yeah, the sci-fi elements of those stories is really where they work well. Though I will admit, Patrick Stewart was a lot of fun as one of the main warriors, so he's always good to see. And even though this movie is definitely trying to be more like the Mirage comics, at the same time it also feels like they're trying to capture the feel of the TMNT series at the time, the 2003 series, which I did enjoy, but I definitely prefer the original 80s series and the 2012 series more. The 2012 series is by far my best version of TMNT that has ever been, and the original 80s series is still a lot of fun. The 2003 series has a lot of good elements to it, but it just feels more like the bridge between those two versions, so that's just how I feel about that one. It does kind of feel like a movie where they were given a lot of notes and they kind of kept getting pulled in different directions. So I can imagine the people who originally wanted to make the movie were like, okay, we want to make it more like the Mirage comics, and then the studio went, okay, that's fine, but make sure you also make it like the cartoon series so we can get the kids in there as well. And even though the 2003 series is a lot more like the Mirage comics, it's still more or less its own thing. It's got a lot of original ideas to it. The Turtles are given a lot more personality than the Mirage comics were, and yeah, it definitely feels like it's more kid-orientated, because the original Mirage comics can get surprisingly adult in some sections. But I will say that the visual quality of this movie is definitely its strongest point. It is amazing. It's some of the best CGI you could have seen back in that day. Nowadays it's not that impressive considering what we can get with movies and even TV shows now, but back then it looked amazing. The textures almost looked like real life, but the designs were very cartoony. It was something we hadn't really seen before in movies, and it looked incredible. The action scenes are also a lot of fun as well, even if they're sometimes a little bit too fast and too hectic to follow, and the amount of camera moving that goes on in between them can get a little bit tiresome. They still look very impressive. They also do some good stuff with the drama between Leo and Raph in this movie, which has always been some of the more interesting parts with the drama in this series, even if they do kind of overuse it in a few adaptations, but this one does it really well. And also the voice of Splinter, who's played by Mako, who also played Aku in Samurai Jack, he does a really good job, even if his voice is a little bit raspy and it is a little bit distracting. He still does a really good job. The only real major problem I have with the movie is, like I said, it's very confusing if it is within continuity with the original movies or if it isn't. It kind of seems to not be able to make its mind up. But even then, it's still not a massive problem, and it is still a very entertaining movie, but I think I'd probably still rather watch the first two. So, as a film series, it's definitely a very eclectic one, but considering where it came from, one of the most silliest ideas for a story ever, and a franchise that was probably the biggest franchise ever for like 5 years in the late 80s and early 90s, I think it actually came out pretty well, but it has been a big part in creating more identity and iconography for the franchise, and elements from it have been reused even since then, so that's pretty cool. Like I said, I haven't watched the Michael Bay movies or the Rise of the TMNT movie, so I can't really give my opinions on those, but I have no real interest in watching those anyway, but who knows, maybe in the future. But let's see what I sneak up on next time.